Welcome to our discussion today. I'm Rebecca Parlakian, Senior Director of Programs at 0 to 3. We're a nonprofit organization focused on the healthy development of babies, toddlers, and preschoolers. I'm a child development and parenting specialist by training, and I've developed a wide range of resources on early screen use for both families and professionals as part of my role. And I am thrilled to be here today to have this conversation. In our session, we've organized our time together to give you an opportunity to really appreciate the ways in which screen media experiences may be shaping very young children's early development, as well as their relationships with parents and primary caregivers. It's just such a fascinating and rich topic, and we have two incredibly talented researchers and scientists here to help us dive in. Dr. Sheri Madigan will kick us off with an exploration of the complex interplay between early screen experiences and infant-toddler development. Dr. Madigan is a professor, clinical psychologist, and Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary and the Alberta Children's Hospital Research Institute. She investigates the impact of parent and child digital media on child development and mental health. Dr. Madigan serves on the American Academy of Pediatrics 2025 Screen Use Guidelines Committee and is also an advisory board member for the Canadian Pediatric Society Center for Healthy Screen Use. Next, we'll have Dr. Brandon McDaniel shine a spotlight on us, the adults in very young children's lives, and he'll share his work on how parent screen use can impact parent well-being and infant care. Dr. McDaniel is a senior research scientist at the Parkview Miro Center for Research and Innovation, as well as an adjunct clinical assistant professor of pediatrics at Indiana University School of Medicine. Dr. McDaniel's research explores the dyadic nature of early screen use, particularly the ways in which parent screen use interacts with parent-child relationships and child development. Today, he'll be sharing some results from one of his latest studies, and with its focus on smartphone use, something I think we can probably all relate to, I'm sure it will generate rich discussion. Following their brief presentations, we'll have a good amount of time for your comments and questions, and we're looking forward to a robust discussion on what it means to be a baby born into a world of screen media experiences. Dr. Madigan, take it away.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and while I'm up here to Children and Screens for hosting what is already a spectacular conference. So I'm up here, and I have the pleasure of presenting with Daniel, whom I met at the last Screen Time conference. So I hope as you're all milling about, you're also getting to know one another. I think that's really one of the benefits of this conference as well. So I'm really interested in early childhood development, and I'm so glad that Children's Screens is sort of putting a spotlight on that work today. We're gonna talk primarily about parents, but I really want to start with situating us in that parents are not the only contributors to children's development. So while we're going to use the word parent and caregiver a lot, let's remember that children are embedded in a nested layer of care, what we're calling circles of care, and the digital ecosystem as part of the new AAP's Screen Time Guidelines, which are due to come out this fall and are being led by Tiffany Munzer, who's here as well. It's not just parents who play an influence, and we put a lot of pressure and a lot of burden on parents if they're the only ones we're talking about. We've got a layer that is the digital interface and the way that they're designed to keep kids on screens as long as possible. And we also have a layer that's about community and society. Parents who are stressed because they have to work 3 jobs or putting their kids on screen, for example, and our governmental systems and policies also play a role in children's screen use. So We're going to talk about parents, but I want us to remember these layers of care, and I hope we can come back to that as part of our discussion. So just to give you a little bit of an overview about what's going on in terms of kids' screen use, what's the new normal for kids 0 to 5 or 0 to 8? So on average, there's a complete saturation of devices in the household. It used to be about 10 to 12 devices per household, and post-pandemic, we're now up to 20 to 25 connected devices in any given household, which is enormous. And kids 0 to 8, based on the most common sense media report, are spending on average 3.7 hours per day using screens recreationally. This isn't at school. This is just using screens on their time. Now, this stat really contrasts with research looking at how many kids are meeting these screen time guidelines. So a few years ago, we published a study looking at the number of kids under 2 meeting the screen time guidelines of no screen time, except really video chatting. 1 in 4 children are meeting, or 1 in 4 families, let's say, are meeting that screen time guideline. In kids 2 to 5, the recommendation is 1 hour per day, making it high-quality programming as to the extent possible in co-viewing, and only 1 out of 3 children are meeting that globally, that guideline globally. So this led us to conduct a study to really think about, amongst all the factors that are kind of around kids' environments and these nested layers of inference, from whether they're in childcare to whether they have siblings to what their parents' screen use was to what their socioeconomic status was, what was the most potent predictor of children's meeting the guidelines or not meeting the guidelines? Does anyone have a guess? Parents. So parents' screen time use was the strongest predictor of whether kids were meeting the guidelines or not. And if we have a developmentalist in the room, this is no surprise. So I'm going to play this, or hopefully someone's going to play this video. And what you can see is that children's modeling of behavior, even before they know what's going on or have a device in their hand, is really influential. So I think it gets played. Here we go. Right. So here they're learning from their furry friend and have learned really early how to put a stuffy in their mouth the same way that their furry friend does. Parents, even though they don't have a device in their hand at this age, they're watching devices in their hand, they're learning how devices are used. Social learning and modeling happens really early in development. And then we know that parents, then screen time habits form and develop. So we know that this is going on even before they have a device in their hand, and then once device ownership becomes more of a reality for young kids, they're less likely to meet these guidelines. So that's what we know about meeting the screen time guidelines. What we've talked about a lot, what I've heard a lot about and has been a movement towards, is talking about the risks versus the benefits of screen use. So I'll talk a little bit about what the recent research says about that. I like to talk about it in early child development as the quality of use versus the quantity of use, because I think those two things are really important. We don't have any research evidence to say that high quality of use is a benefit. So we need to keep that in mind. There's really consistent evidence on quantity of use, is that as screen time goes up, behavior problems go up, language skills go down, sleep goes down, physical activity goes down. That is really consistent. So there isn't much benefit to high doses of screen use. But there is a benefit to some quality elements of screen use. So this is a meta-analysis we published a little while ago, really looking at children's screen time and their language outcome. And you can see the difference between quantity of use in terms of duration of hours of use, but also just screen in the background. You can see that that's associated with reductions in language skills. So high screen time use in any way, lower language skills. But if you look at the quality of how they're using screens, so was the content educational? Was there co-viewing involved? That quality indicator was associated with some benefits to children's language. So how we frame the conversation can be really framed in quantity, not great, quality, maybe good. So we can think about it in that way. And this is a really important caveat for me as someone who studies relational health with kids and parents. While there is some benefit here, the correlation is 0.12 across a large number of studies in this meta-analysis of educational content, the quality of interactions kids get outside of device use, caregiver interactions, serve and return interactions, those are going to trump any benefit they're going to get from educational content. So the kids learn best when they're interacting with caregivers and they're getting these serve and return interactions outside of device use. And then the other big question that's been in our field research-wise is the chicken or the egg question. So are kids who get high doses of screen time having problems with their behavior? Are they high doses of screen time associated with delays in developmental milestones? Or is it actually the reverse? Is it that kids are having delays in developmental milestones? Are they more likely to be put on screens later in development because caregivers are trying to modulate challenging behaviors, or because caregivers think if they put them on screens, maybe they'll benefit from them? So this has been the big chicken or egg debate. And in 2019, we published a study really trying to disentangle that, and this has only been made possible through some new developments in terms of statistical analyses that have been advanced. I'm going to break down this model really quickly and simply. So when you see what you see here is kids' ages and stages, so their achievement of developmental milestones over various periods of the preschool period, and screen time. And so we measure these things repeatedly. And one of the things we're able to get here is that between level variable there, which is 0.19. And what that's really saying is that kids on average who have high amounts of screen time over these time periods have poor developmental, are not reaching their developmental milestones at a pace that we'd like them to. But what you see at the within-person level is something that's really interesting, which is saying on average, when an individual child has high doses of screen time, what does that mean for their development later on? And what these statistics are saying is that when kids have high doses of screen time compared to what they usually would get, we're seeing a delay in their developmental milestone at subsequent time points. So it's really relative to themselves in these particular models, and what that gets us is a lot closer to causality. It doesn't get us causality, but it gets us as close to causality in these observational designs. And this has been replicated by many teams across the world, and also folks here, Carolyn Fitzpatrick, Jenny Radeski, really looking at how screen time is associated. For example, I'll just shout out Carolyn Fitzpatrick's work, where it's looking at tablet use and how that's related to anger outbursts over time, looking at similar models like this and showing a very similar pattern of associations. So we're seeing that screen time is the culprit in most of these models and not the other way around in terms of behavior problems or language skills predicting later increases in screen time. It really is screen time is the culprit. I'm just going to send out this final reminder that we're really just talking about caregivers here, but let's keep in mind that there's a lot of other factors that we have to keep in mind, because I'm going to talk about just the things that we want to focus on after Daniel's talk, or Brandon's talk, which is really just talking about what can we do here? So there's a QR code that summarizes all this in case that's helpful, but I think we really need to talk to families really from a more relational health standpoint. So it's really difficult. We heard Sarah Coyne talk about how much guilt families are experiencing about their child's screen use. So knowing they're coming in with all that guilt, if we can work on relational health with them and talk about screen times in a way that actually encourages conversation around it, we might get more uptake of these guidelines. So we need to start by recognizing what families are doing well. When we see them talking, playing, telling us about a hike they've gone on, whatever they've done, reinforcing that, saying that's really important for kids' development. And so recognizing that. Use open-ended questions to really spark reflection. So instead of saying, did you know that you're supposed to turn off screens 1 hour before kids go to bed? Rather than sort of imposing that on them, spark a little curiosity and say, tell me about your nighttime routine. And if parents are actually doing that, they're turning the screens off, it's a great relational health moment with them to say, that's amazing, keep doing that. That actually makes a difference for kids' quality of sleep. And then we can ask them, like, what's getting in the way of those routines as a follow-up question, and then problem solving with them so that it's a more collaborative approach. So explore barriers with curiosity, ask families what they value, what matters to them. Most of them are gonna say connection, very few of them are gonna say screen time. So once they actually put that on the table, you can actually have a conversation about what gets in the way of them having those values as a family. 9 out of 10 times parents are gonna say screen time's driving them nuts with their family, and so it's gonna open up a conversation, but it really takes some of the blame and shame off of that. So that's the next one, just avoid acknowledge the realities. Families are really stressed, working multiple jobs. Screen time might actually sometimes be a really great solution to getting a good meal on the table. And we wanna actually tell parents and families that's really important too. So if you wanna get a good meal on the table and you've gotta cook while that's happening, that's great. When you get to the table, what's happening when you get there? And let's hope that they're turning devices off, or you can encourage that so they can have some device-free dinners, because we know that when that happens, families can connect. So we need families to disconnect to connect. And then lastly, of course, as part of the screen time guidelines, we want to promote co-viewing and engagement. So really encouraging caregivers to be running commentators, even though the screen is on, talking about what kids are doing, what is happening on the screen, and scaffolding development in the same way we would do if the screen was off and they were teaching them how to build blocks. And then I think it's really important to explain the why behind limits. So this is something Stephanie Reek and I have been talking about, is just saying these are the screen time limits is probably insufficient to really absorb learning. The screen time limits are there based on lots of evidence to suggest that when they're there in large duration, kids aren't doing great. And so we need to talk to parents about why they're there in the first place. And then focus on progress, not perfection. I think we have to really kind of try to encourage these small, manageable steps for families. Not everyone's going to be able to whip up and take up the guidelines in seconds, but we can really reinforce that relational health aspect by encouraging them to keep going and to take those meaningful steps that can create lasting change. So that's it for me for now. I look forward to our conversation, and there's all the socials and websites and all those things. Thanks for listening.
All right, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here with all of you today and to talk a little bit more about the different side. Now let's focus in on the parents. I'd like to disclose that I have funding from the National Institutes of Health as well as Children in Screens, and I'll be talking about some of those things today. I also want to acknowledge my wonderful co-investigators and co-authors on a lot of this work. It's clear from the research that we have already that device use can impact the quality of infant caregiving. We have terms, right, that we've got out there like technoference, this idea that technology and device use can intrude and interrupt face-to-face interactions and time spent together. We have concerns that it's possible that this might impact the quality of attachment over time. Some of the reasons why we have these concerns is if we just look at the I guess I'll say we have experimental and observational evidence at this point to be able to show that at least in the moment that distraction or device use is happening in caregiving or by a parent or a caregiver, that responsiveness, that responsiveness of the parent or caregiver to the infant or child may decrease. That if we look at different kinds of contexts like infant feeding, that in those kinds of contexts, responsiveness, the focus on the infant, different kinds of things like cognitive growth fostering also goes down. And if we look in observational work, we see other kinds of examples where the amount of eye contact or the vocalizations that the parent is giving to the child will also decrease. So those are just some examples. I only give those to show that there's already enough experimental and observational evidence to show that when device use is happening, it changes the interactions and the time spent together. Now, like I was saying, for many of us, we begin to get concerned that that might lead to some changes and impacts on the quality and security of the attachment relationship between, let's say, an infant and a parent. The reason why we begin to get concerned is because if that responsiveness and these other pieces are decreasing, you can see that, well, one of the strongest or one of the predictors of attachment security is sensitivity. And by sensitivity, I don't just mean being like warm and loving. I really am thinking about it in that technical sense of that it's that we're thinking about the awareness of the cues that are happening, the timeliness of the response, and so forth. And that we want that response to be an appropriate response in the moment. And if just like we were seeing in some of that experimental and observational evidence, it may impact all of those aspects of sensitivity in that moment that the distraction is happening. And we do have some recent work. A recent meta-analysis has found that there is a significant negative association between parent device use and the child's presence and attachment security. However, that was, even in that meta-analysis, that was only based on 3 studies. There's a lot of different variation. I don't think we can put a lot of stock in that yet. So what does that mean for us? Really, what we know is that in the moments that device use is happening, in those specific moments, the responsiveness changes, okay? But long-term, like what's the long-term ramifications of these momentary distractions? The jury really is still out on that, and that's something that we're trying to figure out. But we do have those concerns. I also want to take us in this other direction of, okay, well, we know that it can change the quality of caregiving in the moment, but there's more to think about here. We need to think about this more holistically and how parents and caregivers are feeling and experiencing this device use. It's embedded. You just think about your own device use. It's embedded in your daily life. You use it for so many different things. And so if you think about this, I've been thinking about it more recently, calling it sort of, we have the inside where it can be empowering to you, or you have the side where it can be distressing to you. And often these things are co-occurring even simultaneously. So there may be using it in ways that it's calming them down in the moment, helping them to regulate their emotions and perhaps find parenting information. And the list could go on and on and on about the ways that they can potentially empower their parenting. But simultaneously, they may, like we've heard in other talks and panels, it may be causing them shame and guilt, and these calling up these sorts of feelings while they're doing that. Or they may get on the device and be exposed to content where they're seeing, well, look at what that mother's doing with her child, and I'm not feeling that way. And all of a sudden, now what they got on for to calm themselves down in the moment that they're feeling very stressed, and instead of empowering them, is now actually made them feel worse about themselves as a mother. And now that changes the way that caregiving will go after that interaction with their device. So there's just a lot of complexity there. I wanted to bring up some examples here where you can see that, so we had done interviews with parents, and even as they describe their phone use, they're saying things like, well, it helps me to decompress or not to yell at my kids, but other times I could be tending to my kids. I feel a lot of guilt. I don't feel good about doing it. I might use it as an escape, but those problems are still there. I need to value what's valuable. So they're talking about their child there. But I want to think I can do many things at once and shoot out a text with my left hand. And it's my best tool that I have for social support, but it's a double-edged sword. So what I'm communicating here and what parents are communicating to us is that the empowerment and the distress co-occur. This is a simultaneous sort of feeling and interaction that they're having around this. And it's complex. So then comes Project Embrace, which is funded by Children and Screens, where we're looking at over 160 mothers of infants. We've completed data collection, this longitudinal data collection, although the analyses I'm going to present today are preliminary. And what we did, or what I'm going to focus on right now, is going to be the phone use measurement and the EMA survey measurement. So at month 2, 3, 4, and 5 of infant age, we had measured their phone use via an app installed on the mother's device across that entire period, continuously. And then we also have these bursts of 5 surveys per day for 5 days during each of these months. And we tried to develop some items that we believed would get at some of these empowering kinds of feelings that these mothers might experience. We couldn't make this substantial and all-covering because these are EMA surveys that need to be brief, but we tried to capture what we could. And we did a multi-level factor analysis on all of this data, and we found that really what we had developed anyway broke apart into empowerment specifically around parenting and parenting feelings, and empowerment more personally. Then we also tried to measure the kinds of distressful feelings that they can have, and the multi-level factor analysis broke that apart into us seeing these feelings of guilt, feelings of technoference or having missed parenting moments, these feelings of that I have wasted my time on my device, and these other kind of distressing feelings of feeling more stressed from the device use, or that you are feeling worse even about yourself or your parenting. Now, what you see here is a lot, okay? But what we did is we did a multi-level structural equation model. We actually did many different models here that I'm presenting on these plots. But we ran the models at month 2, ran the models at month 3, ran the models at month 4, and month 5. And I've just combined this all into the plots for you to see it all together. And so what these are the standardized effects of these models, and each of these variables, the predictors are on the left, outcomes are on the top. And so we're using both their objective smartphone use, since we were measuring their smartphone use across the entire period, so we actually were able to link their EMA survey data and their phone use together to figure out how much are they using their phone specifically during the moments that they're around their infant. And so we have that as a predictor, as well as then all these different feelings that they're experiencing. And what we found overall is really interesting here, that the amount of phone use that they're engaging in around their infant really wasn't that predictive of these, at least in the moment, of these momentary feelings their momentary emotional well-being, or their feelings of how caregiving is going. Although I will say that at month 2, so very, very early on, there was an association, but maybe not in the way, well, the boredom one you might have expected, but the other way, it's interesting that lower emotional distress was actually related to them using their phone more in that moment with their child, which is an interesting thing that we could talk more about later if you'd like. If we think about the distressful feelings that they're having from their device use specifically, it may not be that surprising, but what we actually find is that they're also, during those moments that they're experiencing distress from their phone use, they are also feeling more of these distressing kinds of emotions like sadness and anxiety and stress. Those moments when they are perceiving technoference to be occurring, they also are perceiving themselves to be kind of worse in their caregiving, having more delayed responsiveness to their infant. In terms of empowerment or these kinds of feelings, what is really interesting is there wasn't a lot going on in terms of the parenting empowerment, which is interesting because mothers, caregivers, will talk a lot about that parenting empowerment. But what we do see is that on the personal empowerment, which was like calming yourself down and some of these other pieces, during those moments, during the moments that they were more emotionally distressed or feeling lonely or feeling bored, during those specific moments, they actually felt more empowered personally by their device use. So what does that all mean? Overall, it's really interesting to think about that at least when we are thinking about mother's own feelings and experiences here and well-being, the actual phone use that is happening in the moment around their infant, that observed amount of time really isn't that related to their feelings. What really matters more is their perceptions of what is happening, which also I think connects to a lot of the other panels and some of the things that we're talking about, that this idea of the assessment that we're making about our device use becomes really important, and the guidance that we're giving to parents and the ways that we are maybe unintentionally instilling shame or some of these pieces in parents is really important to think about. Also, that idea that during these specific moments when they're feeling distressed or they're feeling lonely or they're feeling really bored, that they actually feel more empowered by their device use. And although I can't really conclude anything right now from this analysis, but that may suggest that for them, at least the experience of that may actually be empowering, depending upon how it's being used, if it's being used in a way that is personally empowering. What does it all mean? There's many other things that I could have presented from prior work or the literature, and so thinking about my knowledge of the literature that's already out there and some of the work I've done in other studies, plus this one together, really the things that lead to parents and caregivers feeling efficacious and good and having really great personal and parenting well-being is if the phone use is supportive, if they perceive that as being supportive to them in the moment, and they feel like I have control over this. Because in other interviews that I didn't present right here, I've talked with parents, and there are times when they're feeling out of control, like they've lost a sense of control over their device use, and it's kind of taken over. And when that's happening, then all of the distressful emotions, all these things really come along with that. And when the use is fitting, when the use fits specifically into their parenting experiences and is supporting them in their parenting goals, and when they've managed to do that, that feels really good to them as well. So my take-home message of all of this is really that we need to stop it with having that perspective that phone use is bad. I think that is the predominant narrative in the media, in a lot of the studies that are out there, and I think some of that even began with the technoference literature that I started and all of these things, but I think that was never the intent of that literature. The literature is to call attention to the fact that yes, during moments when device use is happening, there is technoference, right? There is distraction. It can change the quality of caregiving, and we should be concerned about that, because if it is happening often and heavy, then that could potentially change the quality of overall caregiving, attachment security, relationships, all of these things. But really, it is much more nuanced and complicated than that. And you could imagine a caregiver using their device in a moment. It causes a distraction in that moment. However, they were about to completely lose it and yell at their child. And the fact that they got on their device calmed them down in that moment, and then they were more emotionally available, engaged in better parenting for the next 6 hours. So what would you conclude from that? The fact that they allowed the device use to cause a distraction, would that end up giving a negative outcome? Probably not. And that's because we need to account for all of the real complexities of what's happening here. I also would say that what I presented was about mothers' feelings and experiences. I didn't present anything about how the infant is feeling or what they're experiencing and what their outcomes might be. And so I think we have to also think about that side. So here's another complexity to that, because maybe to the mother, that felt really good, it was empowering, they are now going to be a better parent, but to the infant, if it's happening a lot, all they're seeing is the blank face and the fact that their mother's distracted, and all of a sudden to them, the experience becomes, I'm maybe a little bit less securely attached to my mother because I don't know what's happening, and this is inconsistent, and et cetera, okay? So the take-home message, though, is we should be working with these mothers, parents, caregivers to help them understand that it is completely normal and okay for device use to be occurring, although we should be careful and considering whether we're being intentional about this use, and really to not overshame them in terms of that, like, well, anytime you're doing this, this is really, really bad. But we can talk a lot more about that. Thank you very much.
Well, there is so much food for thought here in these presentations that really gave us, I think at least gave me, a much deeper understanding of the ecosystem and complexities of screen use in early childhood. And so I'm sure you all have comments and questions to share. We'd like to invite you now to approach the microphones. There's one to my right, probably your left, and to my left, your right, with any questions you might have for our presenters today. We have about 25 minutes left in our time together this morning, so we ask that you keep your questions brief to allow as many of your colleagues as possible to participate. We have our first question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this wonderful information. I love this focus on early childhood, and I think we can talk about it more and more. My name's Rachel. I'm the Early Childhood Advocacy Program Director at Fair Play. And, you know, we've talked about this quite a bit throughout our time this week, but we know that devices and apps are designed to maximize our time on those devices, maximize engagement. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what role does increasing parent awareness around this manipulative design play as we think about technoference and early relational health?
So I guess, essentially it's how do we talk with parents about the design elements that keep individuals really engaged with their phones and perhaps not as much with their children.
I think it's really important to have these conversations with them. The interviews that I've had with parents and the workshops and other things that I've done, typically parents are very open to talking about these things and often really love that someone is, as long as you do it in the way that I was beginning to describe there, of being very supportive and understanding and helping them understand that this really is the world that you live in. It is not your fault that you find yourself drawn back to this device and feel a loss of your sense of control at moments, that you ended up in some unintentional use, like you went on it to do something and then found that you were on it for 10 more minutes than you meant to, and all of these things. I have found that in discussing those kinds of like what actually exists inside of that and what's causing some of that, helps them to have that evidence for them to feel better about themselves and more efficacious in being able to make some changes. And then I think we can't just discuss that and then leave them with no tools either. So I often would suggest helping them understand that you have to be able to take some of the things that have become really unconscious habits and turn them into something that is conscious, because that's the definition of a habit, is that it's just something that you do, you didn't even really make an intentional decision. And so we can't just tell them to make intentional decisions, because it's designed to make you not make intentional decisions. So maybe you might help them to understand that there are particular apps or other pieces out there on the devices that they can use that can change that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that sort of nice answer to the question is, like, from a relational health standpoint, I think it's really helpful with caregivers to say, how do these phones feel different than how we grew up with screens, right? Which are directly different for most of us because we grew up watching TV that wasn't digitally engineered. There were still commercials. There was, we used to get around as a community and watch it, say on movie nights with families or whatever it was. And that feels different, and I think a lot of that resonates with a lot of caregivers. So I think rather than start with that the screens, they're digitally engineered, I think asking them, sparking that curiosity around, like, how do these feel different to you? And then talking through the things that you just mentioned around, the ownership, the accountability of these platforms in that their goal is to keep us on as long as possible. And while as adults we can manage that a little bit and recognize that, kids don't have that capacity. So how can we support them in understanding that, but in also disconnecting from it? It was a great question.
I would also just throw in that we want parents to trust us, right? And to be able to have these conversations with us, because we want these conversations to continue across childhood. And so starting off with no shame is so critical. Yeah.
So I want to zoom back out to the macro level. And we live in a country with abysmal parental leave policies. And one of the things that devices do is bring the workplace into the home. Mean that parents are often balancing being responsive to work while caring for children, and or using screens the way maybe TVs were used in the past as babysitters when you're in a rush after you've had a long day of work or transitioning between two jobs and having to get something done. And I'm curious whether any of the research on parental screen time use or the use of screens by parents for childcare has been leveraged to argue for stronger parental leave policies, or if you think there's an opening for that.
So I don't know the answer to that question, and someone from the US could probably speak to that a lot better than someone from Canada, where we have 12 to 18 months of leave. Paid leave. For both parents. So just adding that in, dads are important too. But what I can say is in the new screen time guidelines that'll come out in the fall, this is something we've drawn attention to. So, families who don't have paid leave are going to have to make really different decisions in how they manage their time. And so that's that nested layer, really calling upon policies to think about what paid leave might mean for families and setting up really healthy digital habits early in child development, which is especially important because we know that that precedent that gets set early is often what's sustained over time. So I can only just say that we've drawn attention to that in the revised screen time guidelines that'll come out, but maybe you can speak more directly to the other nature of the question as an American.
I wish I could, but I am not often involved in the policy like that, so I don't have a specific answer for you. I will say this, though, that I think that kind of work is very necessary and needed to be able to help with parental leave. But I'll go back to the shame kind of an idea here, that one of the things that we can do in our research and in our work with parents is to help them understand that yes, you have a real life with real circumstances, real barriers. It is okay for you to have those barriers and for you to have to do what works inside of your family. Let's just sit down and talk about it, and let's try to make some intentional decisions and understand that you may not be able to do it in the completely phone abstinence kind of way or these different things. That's okay. Be intentional about what you want, and if that means that you have to be on your device a lot during the day, then maybe figure out if there are particular times during that day that you can set up intentional screen-free times with your infant or your child or your teen or these kinds of things.
I know from the 0 to 3 Policy Center that I don't believe we've used that frame to provide support for parental leave, but I'm definitely going to take it back, so I appreciate that comment. I think in fairness, we're going to ping pong to this side. Thank you for waiting.
Not a problem. My name is Matt. I'm with the Learn the Signs Act Early program at the CDC for California specifically. My question is probably more for Sheri. You had mentioned that your research has associated more screen time with missing milestones and developmental delays. I'm curious, I'm seeing a ton of new apps that are coming out that are being framed as good for child development, especially targeting young parents of, say, like 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds. And so I'm curious, has your research been able to see a difference between just screen time or educational programs? Have you seen a difference with that at all?
Yeah, so I can speak not to individual apps, but can speak to the educational programs component. So what we've found in some elements of children's development is that when the programming is educational or when caregivers are sitting down and co-viewing with the kids, we see some augmentation to development, which is good. So again, good quality screen time in moderate doses may be somewhat beneficial to some aspects of children's development. That said, it's really trumped by like caregiver-child or enriching interactions, face-to-face. And some of the work by Rachel Barr, who's I think here, has shown that actually kids learn very little from screens under the age of 2. So there's actually like a developmental stage component to this that's really important. They can't quite get what's on the screen. It's 2-dimensional instead of 3-dimensional real life. It's not being facilitated by a parent. There's less learning that can happen, whereas kids who are a little bit older, they might absorb some learning. So while we looked at like children across an age range and showed some developmental benefit, small and not as strong as what you would get from a caregiver, for example, it may be that young kids don't get any. And that's really why, some of the evidence based around the screen time guidelines for under 2 is to limit screen time altogether, because kids aren't learning from it and they're learning most from person-to-person interactions. I know that some researchers, I think Jenny Radeski has done some coding, and maybe others, I'm sorry if I don't know, but like coding of different things that are purportedly educational, and in the end, very few of them really are. And some folks in this room have done work looking at, what are the benefits of some programming, like Sesame Street there is some benefit, but other programs that are really for profit, like Baby Einstein, there hasn't been any suggestion that that's a benefit. So I know that's like a bit old school DVD stuff I'm talking about, but not apps, but just that I think that we can't assume that there's a lot of learning on the apps, and that it's probably really dictated by the age of the child and how much parents are facilitating learning.
Thank you very much. And as someone who grew up on VHSs, thank you for that DVD comment.
Here we go.
Hi, my name is Randy Coleman. I just started a new nonprofit called Digitally Nutritious, which is focused on helping neurodivergent kids with screen time and their parents and providers to kind of have some guidelines around doing that. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is AI companions, and how AI is going to be affecting kids, particularly in terms of some of the relationship issues. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts or ideas about that.
Well, I just wrote up a commentary article recently in Family Relations about the possibility of attachment to AI that can occur. So I think, I'm not saying that I'm not trying to be like a doomsayer or anything here. I'm just saying that with AI becoming, like with AI companions and these things, becoming more and more realistic and exhibiting more and more actual relational kinds of features and interacting with you like a real person, especially with children who have less of an understanding than adults about that it's not a real person interacting with them, it could actually begin to activate our attachment system, because it's like we are receiving care from that entity in the same way that we would receive like emotional care from someone else. And we don't know what that will actually look like over time, what the long-term ramifications of that will be. So anyway, you can go read that article just to call some attention to that.
Hi, I'm Camila. I founded a movement in Brazil to protect kids as a collective action led from parents. And other than that, I'm also advocating for paternity leave in Brazil, for longer paternity leave. The reason for that is because countries that have adopted longer paternity leave manage to increase the father participation in caring for children. So I want to take the opportunity that someone brought that topic and just ask or maybe suggest whether there has been studies if the father is participating more on the child care and not leaving most of the work for the mothers, which are definitely tired, exhausted, and burning out, if they will probably need less of the screens. Because from personal experience also, I can say that when fathers are helping, that's going to be effective both on practical things, practical help, but also emotional support, which are things that you mentioned that the smartphones were being helpful for mothers.
Well, obrigado pela pergunta.
Ah, wow.
I think that definitely having a supportive partner is very helpful in terms of the mother's emotional health and well-being, and the problem is that the way things often get divided. Well, I'll say this: if we go back, many fathers believe they're going to be more involved than they actually end up being, and many mothers believe that that the father is going to be more involved than they end up being from the very beginning. And there's a lot of structural barriers to fathers being more involved, like you're bringing up, which is why we would need things like better parental leave. But even if they had the parental leave, if things aren't set up very early on by them to help the father be more involved, like for example, a father might believe, like, I'm going to be really involved, and they hadn't even thought about the fact that, like, wait a second, I can't breastfeed. And so then all this, and there are ways that you could still help the father to be more involved in that, but they'd have to be very intentional. So the problem is, this would be a very long answer, but what I will say is that we don't actually know if having a partner or having that more supportive relationship with the partner will lead to a reduction in let's say the mother's screen time around her baby or child in that moment. But I believe that is a really important direction to be thinking about as well, like you brought up.
So here's, sorry to breaking the protocol, but here's my ask for us all: start to involve more of the father and using that data to advocate for change. Thank you.
I had a question about, what is it about the parent's screen time that really impacts the child's screen time? Is it that the parent is simply trying to be on the screen themselves, and so then they're like, okay, here, you have this device so that you're not bothering me while I'm on the screen? Like, what is it about that? And I was also kind of curious as to whether it makes a difference in terms of the parents, like, for example, if the father doesn't use screen time as much as the mother, or vice versa, does that have a differential impact on the child?
I mean, those are really terrific questions. The last one on fathers, we don't have a lot of research as far as I know, and you might know more, but I think that's a really underdeveloped area that we need a lot more concentrated research time on. So if anyone's looking for a gap in the literature, that's a great one to fill. I think when it comes to parent screen time predicting child screen time, we're really talking about intergenerational effects, right? And there are intergenerational effects across so many aspects of human development. There are intergenerational effects of trauma, intergenerational effects of mental health. This is really common. So it's not surprising that we see that there's a correlation between parent screen time and kids screen time. I think you really talked about the mechanisms, like what might be going on there. And really, I think it's once it's habituated that screens are used in large durations, it's no surprise that caregivers would let their kids on screens. It's what's normal for them. It's what's habitual for them. So it's like a habit-forming nature that actually operates at the family level rather than at the individual child level necessarily. It's kind of like what's adopted family-wise. So, and it's possible that families who watch large screens, we're seeing that they don't prioritize physical activity or getting outside. And of course, then the children, they often need a facilitator for some of those activities, especially early in child development. You know, you've got to wrap them up. Sorry, I'm again Canadian. I was thinking about like wrapping them up in coats, but like wrap them up, get them outside, which can be really hard in the wintertime. This is my personal experience. And then, or, you know, get them to a park, get them to a play date, whatever. Like there has to be real intention and energy for that. You know, if that's not a priority of the family, then obviously screen time is going to be a nice default mechanism for them to engage in. Same thing with sleep. It's intergenerational, and it's also, we know that when parents are getting less sleep, you know, they might also use screens more with the kids because they're just trying to get through the day. So I think that we know these patterns are pretty solidified within families, not just for screen time, but for most aspects of human development.
But just to follow up on that question, I'm just kind of curious because now there's this expectation in the workplace that parents should be responding to emails and like all of that at any time, anywhere you are. And I wonder if that is different than just scrolling mindlessly to kind of, or like seeking support or what, you know, what have you, in terms of influencing the child's screen habits.
I mean, in terms of influencing children's screen habits, I don't know exactly. But in terms of the possibility of the effects on the child, it'll still cause the distraction in the moment, just the way the other one would have. Depending upon, if we're talking about infants, it's not really going to matter whether you say I'm getting on it for my work or I'm getting on it to scroll social media. So we have to think developmentally here about what age ranges we're really talking about. If they're older and can understand what's happening, you know, you can explain that this is why I have to do this and this is what is happening and I am so sorry and I will be with you, you know, here in 30 minutes, which I know doesn't go really great. I'm not trying to act like that would go perfectly. But so you have to think about the developmental age if you're going to try to understand that question first off. And there's work to suggest that even among adults, you know, I mean, I've even done some experimental work with like college students, for example, that when an important reason is given for the device use that they're doing right in the middle of that moment of the interaction, that it might change the perception of the other person a little bit to where it doesn't feel as exclusionary or like that, but they still feel, they still end up, the partner still ends up feeling like that was a bit exclusionary, that they felt worse about the interaction and the quality of that interaction and these sorts of things. So if we take that down to like the teen or a child level, you know, there's lots of work observationally and kind of correlationally to suggest that it would still affect them in a lot of the same kinds of ways.
I'll just say really quickly is that there's good research also that looks at the frequency of getting on your phone and the duration. So it's actually the duration that's a little bit more problematic. You get absorbed in it, and then of course you're missing cues and signals that could be really important to foster early child relations and growth. But we're all on our phones, you know, maybe it's to organize a play date or to find out what the library hours or whatever it is. And quick dips into the phone is not really the problem. It's the absorption and the duration. But I think Pamela.
But real quick, I just want to say I like going back to your question though. But it sets up a habit. There's modeling that is happening, and so we also need to be careful about what are the habits that we are modeling to our children is this the way that we would want them to interact with us or with others, and what kind of an environment are we setting up, and right, which connects to the idea of like why they might end up with certain kinds of habits with their devices and so forth.
Thank you. The winner of our last question of the day is to my left.
Thank you.
Yes, we have about 2 minutes left. Take it away.
This is directed to Brandon, and thank you so much for your brilliant work. In thinking about your study, I was thinking about the responses from the parent, from the caregiver and the mothers specifically, and there's a lot to unpack, but in terms of the developmental age of its infants, and I'm wondering to what extent it looked to me a little bit like self-justification and rationalization on their parts, and wondering about whether or not you're discussing, like, what other coping mechanisms we can impart for them, and also try to understand the root causes of what's going on for them, and maybe not to hold them. There are harms in my reading of the literature in terms of things like technoference and other harms on infants.
So
Time for a 1-minute answer.
I mean,
That was a lot, sorry.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, but I think it's definitely possible that there's a lot of self-justification happening. That's possible, but like that cognitive framing still affects how you then perceive and react to your device use, and whether you're going to feel shame or not, and all these other pieces, which will impact the quality of caregiving. So it's a complex bag of emotions and feelings there that's happening, and it may not be self-justification too, because a lot of the times what we're finding is in that very moment that the device use is happening, they're both feeling empowered and guilty. So it's possible that it's self-justification, but it may also be that, like, I really did feel very good by doing that. It helped me feel support, to receive the support that I needed in the very moment that I needed it, but I also feel very guilty about the fact that I just ignored my infant for 10 minutes. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all for this incredibly rich and robust conversation. I would just like to thank Dr. McDaniel and Dr. Madigan one last time for their sharing.